You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host from New York City, Ankit Panda.
And this is Prashant Parmaswaran from Washington, D.C.
Good to be back with you, Prashant. How are you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing well. Doing well in quarantine here in New York City. Certainly, things are getting a little worse, but we're hopefully going to all get through this. So, obviously, as listeners are aware, we're in the midst of a global pandemic. Much of the world is now coming around to the reality of what that requires in terms of a policy response. So, we're going to spend this podcast again talking a little bit about COVID-19 or the coronavirus disease and its spread around the Asian region, simply because it is the biggest story right now in regional geopolitics, occupying the most of the attention of nearly every government in the Asia Pacific and indeed around the world. But we have two good pegs, I think, for this episode. The first is regarding the postponement of the International Olympic Games this summer. So Japan, which had very much been looking forward to hosting the games, had held off for a fair bit of time, even as it became apparent that there would really be no way that the games could take place under the conditions that had become quite apparent even a month ago as a result of COVID-19. But finally, a few days ago, the Shinzo Abe government, along with the International Olympic Committee, decided that the Olympic Games would be postponed to no later than summer 2021. So by next year, there will be Olympics, but they won't be happening as scheduled this summer. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means for Japan's position more generally, the Abe government's ambitions, certainly the economic consequences for Japan, which are, I think, quite significant to talk about here. And then we'll move on a little bit to talk about COVID-19 in South Asia. We touched on that a little bit 2 podcasts ago when we talked about the virus and its implications around the region. But I think it's really worth zeroing down a little bit, especially as many of the major economies in the region, including most notably India, which has put 1.3 billion people under a lockdown for 3 weeks, are taking drastic steps. So we'll talk a little bit about how the South Asian region is coping and the potential consequences there. But Prashant, so without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the Olympics. So the cancellation, I think, was becoming clearer around a week ago. I mean, on March 23rd, 3 major countries, Australia, Canada, the UK, all said that they would have their teams withdraw from the Olympics if Japan and the IOC didn't agree to postpone it for a year. And I think that really started to break the dam on the inevitable postponement. So this marks the first ever times that the Summer Olympic Games or any Olympic Games have been postponed. They were canceled in 1916 during the First World War and 40 and 44 during the Second World War. But a postponement has never happened before. So this will be pushing the Olympics onto 2021. And then, of course, the Winter Olympic Games will be happening in 2022. But it's really a major setback for the Abe government, which was hoping to have this as sort of a capstone of Prime Minister Abe's time in power. He's the longest-serving post-war prime minister in Japan, in power since 2012 for a second non-consecutive term that is still running. Many had pointed to the fact that the 2012 games would have been sort of a moment of resurgence for Japan after more than a decade after the 2011, or nearly a decade after the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami and Fukushima Daiichi meltdown disasters. But unfortunately, that'll have to come later. But what do you make of this delay? What does it really mean for Japan in your view, Prashant?
I mean, I think as you put it is, sort of difficult to kind of plan for such a big global sporting event amid a global pandemic. And actually we've seen, one of the big consequences of this COVID-19 issue is that we have seen a lot of sports being either canceled or postponed really across the board, which really has, robbed folks of one of the distractions that they might turn to amid this pandemic. And I think this is a case that we've seen here. I think the consequences, like you said, I mean, this was kind of seen as Japan's sort of comeback moment. And so that kind of, removes a little bit of the shine of a moment for Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, which, we've been talking about Asia geopolitics for many years on this podcast. And he's kind of the closest that we have to a sort of a permanent fixture in the Asian security landscape. And so that really is a big development for his leadership. but also, looking forward, given the fact that, there has been this dynamic in Japan where there's talk about, what's going to happen in the next few years with respect to Abe's leadership, potential transition, a subsequent term, potential succession in Japanese politics. It's a big event within Japan's political calendar too. So I'm interested to see how this affects Japan politically. I mean, economically, there's obviously going to be issues with respect to cancellation costs, potential revenue that was supposed to be gotten by Japan. And of course, the impacts on Japan's economy, as with the world economy, with the global pandemic, is going to be important to watch as well.
Yeah, no, I think Abe has certainly proven to be a political survivor. He was dealing with multiple scandals a couple years ago. Looked like he might not last to lead the Liberal Democratic Party, the party that's mostly ruled Japan in the post-world era, with the exception of a brief period of rule by the Democratic Party of Japan. But the Olympics have also brought him in for criticism. There have been cost overruns. And not to mention Japan's initial reaction to the coronavirus, then epidemic, as it was breaking out in China, was also widely criticized within the country. The decision to close down schools prematurely, although in hindsight, Japan did appear to be prescient given the wider state of lockdowns in the region and around the world. And also Tokyo, talking to people in Tokyo right now, it seems like life has mostly been normal. Which the same can't be said for other major cities in the region, including Hong Kong, Seoul, Singapore, where things have slowed down a little bit. But Japan is now evidently turning a corner. There has been some interesting reporting, especially from Reuters and a few other places, talking about the internal sort of wargaming that the Abe administration was doing on the decision to cancel the Olympics. They were sort of caught in a difficult position where early on, if the Abe government had reacted to coronavirus in a more heavy-handed way than it actually did, which many people were calling for, that would inherently make it impossible for Tokyo to even think about hosting the Olympics. So they had to sort of toe the line, even as it became apparent, I think, to many people outside Japan, that really there was no way the Olympics could happen. And I guess politically, there's also, I think one of the significant things to keep in mind is that the eventual decision came as a sort of bilateral statement, right, between the IOC and Abe, in which I think is important because that doesn't actually put the Japanese prime minister out in front of this decision, sort of owning this, owning this very unfortunate turn of events with the pandemic and having to reschedule the games. It allows for Abe to at least absorb the political implication, I think, a little bit better. But I think the cost issue is just going to be insurmountable, right? So there have been cost overruns. Japan is thought to have spent more than 26 billion US dollars on hosting the Olympic Games in Tokyo. The delay, I've seen a few numbers, but the estimates for what the delay will cost Japanese taxpayers on top of what's already been spent is about $3 to $6 billion. So, I think when it comes to Abe's economic plans, Abenomics, and the three arrows of monetary policy, fiscal policy, and structural reform, a lot of that is also about to go haywire, not only because of the delay of the Olympics. Indeed, I think the Olympics are actually going to end up being a minor factor given the broader global economic slowdown, but certainly I think this is looking to be an inauspicious late-term development for Abe, which might, I think, seriously color his legacy as he does prepare to leave office.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that economic legacy is sort of important, right? Because the last time, Japan had its Olympic moment was like in 1998 when, this was supposed to be seen as a comeback moment relative to that period where there was a little bit more uncertainty about Japan's economic growth. And, there were plans to actually show that, Japan was back economically as well as politically. And that kind of may get in the way of that. The other thing that's important to note as well is, I mean, there has been, after Japan, given the postponement, it goes up to 2021. And important to emphasize here that just because there is a postponement, now the attention will turn into, when is this actually going to be held? And if they aren't able to arrive at logistical details to actually reschedule this, the sort of speculation will continue about whether this is going to be actually canceled. A lot of these sporting events, there's been postponements to buy folks time to actually plan for this stuff. But if this pandemic lasts, in the worst case scenarios, till the end of this year, then it's going to be very difficult to actually get this planning in place for 2021. And that matters not only for Japan, but also, you're looking ahead to 2022. China and the Winter Olympics is also the kind of the next main event with respect to Asia in the Olympics. And there have been calls. It's still, not, I wouldn't say, sort of mainstream, but there have been folks that have been calling for, the fact that China has been, not a very responsible actor, whether there should be a boycott of the Olympics or at least a little bit more scrutiny on that. One of the questions I have is, how will this impact some of the later Olympic developments, including China's Winter Olympics, beyond what Japan does in 2021?
Right, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think you sort of hinted at the worst case scenario here for Japan, which is, I think, ultimately a cancellation, resulting in a very high bill for really no payoff. But I mean, I think we should also talk about the better case outcome here. I mean, there is a world where after this pandemic ravages the world, Japan gets to be the country that brings people together. I mean, the Olympic Games come in for a lot of criticism for things like corruption, backdealing, costs, certainly. But ultimately, they are kind of a manifestation of symbolic global unity, showing the best of humanity. So if the Japanese government wants to lean into that and make that sort of the symbol of the Olympic Games in 2021, I think, that could be a really great honor for Japan to be the country that gets to host these games in these very unusual circumstances after the pandemic dust has cleared. But of course, like you said, it's easy to say that on a podcast in March 2020, but it's very difficult to plan around that for next year because, like you said, we just don't know how things are going to develop and change. And certainly there's a lot of scrambling right now in Tokyo to figure out what can and cannot be done for next year. There's also the other issue that I think many of the athletes will be under financial concerns, financial constraints, because next year there is a hope that many regular sports will resume their regular schedules, their tournaments planned, championships planned, and are those going to then be moved so athletes can attend the Olympics? So there's a lot of scheduling issues just to be figured out. But certainly I think this is something that the Japanese government was hoping to not have to deal with in 2020, especially with the anticipation that had been built up. I mean, Tokyo 2020 was the cornerstone of Japan's public diplomacy efforts throughout 2019 and 2018, really calling the world to Japan. And now having to postpone the games is just not a situation that I think anybody in Tokyo had anticipated. So, yeah, we'll have to keep an eye on this. So let's talk a little bit about the spread of coronavirus to South Asia. We hit on South Asia very quickly last time. We talked about the pandemic, but as with exponential growth with these things have come a very long way. So India, I think, is really going to be a major focus of a lot of the global coverage of the pandemic in the coming weeks. So a few days ago, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi put the entire country, 1.3 billion people, under a lockdown for 21 days. And he made a very sort of dramatic appeal saying that, if the Indian people can't handle 21 days under quarantine, he said, this country and your family will go back 21 years, implying that the economic blowback of COVID-19 in India will be vast. And of course, Modi also acknowledged that there would be costs to such a lockdown in the first place. Especially, he noted that this would be particularly difficult for poorer Indians. He added that the only option is social distancing to remain away from each other. There is no way out to escape from coronavirus besides this. And India's reaction, I think, has also been interesting in the diplomatic realm. Modi, for the first time in more than 3 years, activated the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, or SARC, one of the less effective regional institutions in the Asia-Pacific region. It's a collection of the leaders of the South Asian countries. All of the leaders attended except for Pakistan, which sent ministerial level representation to a video conference to discuss the implications of the pandemic for the region at large. And they all the countries began putting in modest amounts of money into a regional fund to support disaster response efforts to the pandemic in the region. But already there's been reports that the Modi government's decision-making, although it has been bold, has left implementation wanting. For example, there was confusion about whether people were allowed to leave their homes to purchase groceries, or how this would be handled for the Modi government is using some smartphone based apps to help people receive
Mhm.
handouts for economic support during this time, but many people don't have smartphones. So, what is the actual implementation going to look like? Some critics of the government have sort of compared this to, other big decisions by the Modi government, including most infamously the November 2016 decision to demonetize the Indian rupee by removing 86% of the country's currency supply from circulation, which also had problems in implementation. But India is certainly taking very bold steps here, and there are concerns in South Asia, not just in India, but in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, around the region, that the poor healthcare infrastructure combined with poverty, combined with high population density, really, really leaves the region incredibly vulnerable to a potentially disastrous pandemic outcome here. But there is still some ambiguity about how the virus behaves in humid climates, hot climates. The summer isn't quite here yet in South Asia, but it is around the corner. India is also the Indian Railways, which are one of the largest employers in the world, the largest employer certainly within India, shut down all of its operations. So I think that was a really major signal to the rest of the country that this was getting quite serious. And you're starting to see pictures from major Indian cities like Mumbai and New Delhi really showing a unrecognizable landscape of just empty areas. People are still, of course, especially poorer Indians who have no other recourse, continue to work and participate in their normal daily activities, and the government's trying to deter that. So you've seen scenes of police sort of cracking down and trying to make sure that people do stay inside. But it's going to be an uphill struggle, I think, for the Indian government from here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is sort of a challenge that really big countries like India face. I mean, that when the situation and this is not unique to India. I mean, the coronavirus we've seen, it has a tendency to sneak up on governments by initially showing up in just a few cases, and the governments kind of think they have it under control, and then it starts escalating quite quickly, and there's just this alarm and panic. And so I think you're seeing kind of the similar trend in India where the government has said, for now, at least for the next few weeks, we'll be on lockdown and let's kind of figure out what we're going to do. I think the key question is with respect to, any lockdown across these countries is it kind of buys you time and mitigates things for a while. But the question is, what do you do with that time? And all that boils down to, the fundamental question you raised, which is if there are concerns about infrastructure, whether it be testing, health facilities, containing local outbreaks, how will the Indian government actually use this time? And one hopes they'll use this effectively to actually manage this. And while they're actually trying to manage all of that, they also have to manage the fallout from this. And part of that is, just the logistics of actually implementing a huge lockdown like this. We've seen similar cases like this in the United States, which is a democracy. China has a little bit more of an easier time because they're not a democracy. And so they can use some of these measures. But the other aspect of this is political, right? So as you pointed out, the Modi government has faced, a lot of criticism for some of its policies, including demonetization, and this notion of authoritarianism and authoritarian tendencies. When you have a lockdown policy like this, it sort of encourages political opponents to kind of point to this as being a manifestation of what the Modi government has been doing. So dealing with not just the pandemic, but also the fallout from these policies is actually going to be a huge challenge. And I really don't think we'll know the outcome in a few weeks. I think the recent indications we've gotten is that there have been, something like 30,000 known tests in India for over 1.3 billion people,
Right.
which is, quite insignificant. So until we get those numbers up, we really won't have a clear sense as to how India is actually, managing the time that it's bought with this 21-day lockdown.
Yeah, right. And I think that's part of the reason why they're going for the lockdown strategy is because of the limited
Mhm.
testing capacity. India is reaching out to, I think, other countries, including South Korea, to receive assistance on testing. But I think it remains to be seen how widespread that testing can be within the country. I think it's worth also talking about the response in Pakistan and Bangladesh. But we can start with Pakistan. I mean, Pakistan was, I think, the first in South Asia to confirm a case on its soil in Karachi, I believe, early on. And that was not so surprising because Pakistan does share a land border with Iran, which, as listeners probably know, is one of the worst struck countries by the coronavirus in general. So Pakistan's been coping with this for a while now. Again, we don't have good testing data from Pakistan, but the government, again, is particularly wary of the economic consequences of COVID-19 to the extent that the Imran Khan government, Prime Minister Imran Khan, oversaw a economic package that is going to result in direct cash transfers to low-income Pakistanis, including laborers, to try and keep them from working day to day. And it is also going to include things like a reduction in gas prices. But of course, the Pakistani government, more so than India in many ways, this crisis is really hitting at an inopportune time. The country just accepted a bailout from the International Monetary Fund not long ago and was hoping to work towards righting its fiscal house, right? I mean, this was supposed to be the time that Pakistan was going to cut down on spending and enter a period of relative austerity to try and balance its accounts. But COVID, I think, is resulting in a total abandonment of those plans, as it is in many other countries. So Pakistan, again, I think, does face many similar issues as India. It has at least been interesting to see that amid the crisis, Pakistan did agree to come to the SAARC meeting with India and the other regional states. There was the original breakdown of SAARC back in 2016 had to do with disagreements between India and Pakistan as in the aftermath of the September 2016 Uri terror attacks by a Pakistan-based terrorist group. The Indians refused to talk to Pakistan at the time, and the meeting collapsed after a few other SAARC states followed India's lead and said that they wouldn't go to the SAARC summit that year in Pakistan. So it is positive to see that public health is bringing the two countries together, since I think there is a lot to be gained in South Asia from regional collaboration and cooperation in a time like this. Bangladesh, I think, is another interesting case. I mean, again, similar to the Indian playbook, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, Bangladeshi leader, has called for a nationwide lockdown. But also an interesting step here is that the Bangladeshi government released a former opposition leader and Prime Minister Khaleda Zia of the Bangladesh Nationalist Party from prison under the condition that she remain at home under quarantine. But she's elderly, and I think maybe the Bangladeshi government was a little concerned about the optics of an opposition leader potentially contracting the virus while in jail and the social consequences that could have. So it's interesting to sort of see the intermingling between these social and political issues in many of these South Asian countries as well. But Bangladesh is also obviously dealing with a number of other issues, including the very large population of Rohingya refugees that have fled from Myanmar. And that's, again, another concern. The humanitarian consequences there, potentially, of a coronavirus outbreak in the Rohingya community could be dire. So there are, I think, serious consequences also in Bangladesh and Pakistan.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think, I mean, to your point about, the Rohingya, I think one of the things that this global pandemic has exposed is really how difficult it is to, regardless of what policies you're implementing, whether it's a lockdown or travel restrictions, how difficult it is to actually implement these policies and prevent folks from moving, right? Whether it's migrant workers in India who are trying to get around and sort of do their work day to day, or it's Nepal, for example. They rely. I think it's something a little bit close to about 10% of Nepal's GDP is reliant on tourism, and they've always been trying to promote this notion of visit Nepal, and they've had to deal with foreign tourists as a challenge really amid this global pandemic. How difficult it is to control people from moving across borders is really something that at least it seems interesting to me in the South Asia context. And as you pointed out, I mean, the SARC thing, I'm not sure what you sort of make of it, but it does seem to me that from a geopolitical perspective, it does stand out as one of the instances where regional cooperation is actually quite evident. I mean, in Southeast Asia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations has really been quite missing in action in terms of Southeast Asian responses. So I did see sort of India's decision to sort of invoke SARC and try to at least make an attempt at a regional response as being sort of interesting, and I wonder how that will play out moving forward.
Yeah, it's difficult to say. I mean, I think there is the more cynical view that India decided to put this SARC meeting together, or at least initiate the SARC meeting to take its kind of traditional position in the region as a leader in a time of crisis, right? So I think that was effective because people have mostly been positively disposed towards the fact that India was able to put aside its differences with Pakistan. The Pakistani side even criticized India over the lockdown in Kashmir during the SARC meeting, but India still went ahead with it, and the funding was coming through from major South Asian countries. It remains to be seen how effective and sustained they'll be going forward. On your note, though, about travel restrictions, it is interesting. I mean, for a country like Bhutan, a country that we almost never talk about on the podcast, the first case that was detected in Bhutan was actually an American tourist. And Bhutan has a very interesting tourism policy where they charge foreigners a fixed fee to be in the country every day to control the influx of tourists into the country so the country doesn't get overrun with backpackers and the like. But after that happened, I mean, Bhutan really had to move fast to lock itself down from travelers from overseas to limit community transmission. And now with India under lockdown, there has been concern that Bhutan might not receive supplies because it does rely quite a bit on India for that. But India has been managing the regular flow of supplies into Bhutan even as it is under lockdown itself. Another issue that I think is interesting with Nepal, and I think this has also come up for a few other countries in the region, is the effect that coronavirus is having on remittances, which are a major source of income for many of these poorer countries in the Asia Pacific, including many countries in Central Asia, where many workers go to Russia and the like. With travel restrictions becoming a very popular policy option for many governments in dealing with this, remittances are taking a major hit because overseas workers are either having to return or they find themselves out of work and stuck without work overseas. So that's again going to blow back economically on many of these poorer, more vulnerable countries. But yeah, with Nepal and tourism, you're absolutely right. I mean, the current government of Nepal under KP Oli and the communists was hoping to build a national economic strategy around tourism. It's one of Nepal's greatest assets, and now it's an issue of timing. I mean, this thing was really supposed to kick off this year. Some of our listeners might recall reading last year about overcrowding on Mount Everest, for which some people criticized the Nepali government for being a little bit too eager to draw people to Nepal for mountaineering and things like that. But this is really, I think, going to be a major blowback for Nepal. And especially for a country that was recovering from a devastating earthquake just a few years ago, there was the hope that things would begin to pick up. But this also, I mean, in the geopolitical context, this has, again, led to concerns in India and other places that coronavirus could give China a major opportunity to attempt to sort of sweep in and help many of these countries pick up the slack economically in many ways. But even with Nepal, I mean, it's interesting that Nepal, which is a participant in the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, has many projects in the country that rely on Chinese workers. And of course, after COVID broke out in China initially, those workers simply stopped coming to Nepal, leaving many of those projects kind of unfinished. And the fate of those projects is now under question as well. So a lot of uncertainty lies ahead for the region. But I thought it was important to lay out some of these issues on this episode in South Asia, since we didn't really talk about that in too much detail on the last episode. Prashant, anything else you want to add before we close it out?
No, and I think the point you brought up about the Belt and Road, I think, is really important because I think that's one of the things I'm definitely watching to see how this crisis actually affects China's global diplomatic and economic practices. Because I think that some of the narratives have been around the fact that the Chinese have been trying to restore their image by sending protective equipment to other countries and trying to make sure that they're reacting to the fact that they were the initial source of the problem. But I think that it's still early days, and I think we'll have to wait and see how this all plays out. I think the Chinese government too is very wary that this is an ongoing story, and they have to work very hard to sort of restore their image, which I think continues to face a lot of challenges, whether it's the narrative and messaging that they've been trying to promote or the realities on the ground. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's something to keep an eye on. But yeah, Prashant, I think we'll close it out here for this week. So as
Mhm.
listeners know, there is a debate right now about how much podcasts should really be covering coronavirus. Many podcasts are just kind of going on as usual, and we have received a fair bit of listener requests to cover this, and of course, I think it is inevitably going to be the biggest story in world geopolitics this year and in Asian geopolitics. We'll probably wait a little bit before, there has been a lot of kind of premature analysis, I think, about what coronavirus means for great power competition. And, is this going to be the moment that China kind of steps up and begins to lead the world? I think it's still way too early to make any of those calls. But as Prashant said, I think with the Belt and Road and things like that, it's interesting to keep an eye on how China and other countries are maneuvering during this time of global crisis. So we'll certainly keep an eye on that. But yeah, we'll try to take a break from the virus and do some of our regular coverage. Like our last episode, we focused on Malaysia and Afghanistan, so we'll continue to focus on those stories. But certainly, if you're interested in a particular aspect of COVID-19 coverage, feel free to reach out to us. We're very happy to take that into consideration. So, as usual, thanks a lot for listening. And if you've been a listener for a while, but you haven't yet subscribed, make sure you do that so you can catch up with future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber, but you haven't yet left us a review, we'd really appreciate it if you could do that on Apple Podcasts, Google Play Podcasts, or any other provider out there, including Spotify, where we're now available. And finally, before we close, just a note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics Podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.